Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Ghosh. Welcome to this discussion. We have a veritable feast for you this afternoon on a topic that this audience hardly needs any introduction to. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression is under threat around the world, as you well know, and not only in the places where we most expect it to be under threat, in totalitarian dictatorships, but also in places that have long prided themselves as champions of democracy, as shining examples of democracy. We see the sort of creeping sense of, or we feel a creeping sense of alarm about the growing intolerance towards free speech. Now, some of this is presented as restrictions on hate speech, restrictions on inciteful speech, but we see that governments often use that as an excuse to go after political opponents or people who are simply saying things that are not really hateful or insightful or inciting, but are simply inconvenient or embarrassing to individual governments or individual politicians. We see this happening in the biggest democracy in the world, India, the country from which I hail. We see it happening in the most powerful democracy in the world, the United States, where I now live and work. We see this happening in countries that pride themselves at being the mothers of democracy, in France, in Britain, in Germany, and of course we see it happening very strikingly in Eastern Europe. As we speak now, the votes are being counted for Austria's presidential elections, and I don't have to tell you what is at stake there. To discuss all of these things today, we have a sterling panel of people who can speak both from a point of view, from the legal, constitutional, 30,000-foot view of these things, but also people who have themselves put their lives, their jobs, their families on the line in championing free speech in their countries and have the scars to tell their tales. So the panel today, I will introduce all of them and then have them come over one by one. In the order at which you will be seeing them, Javier El-Hage, who is the Chief Legal Officer of the Human Rights Foundation and the organizers behind OFF, followed by Dr. Fred Schauer of the University of Virginia, one of the foremost legal minds and who has applied that mighty intelligence to the subjects that we will be covering today. Maina Kiai will be the third speaker. He is a human rights lawyer and activist from Uganda. He's a United Nations Special Rapporteur. And finally, last but definitely not the least, we will hear from Reem Khalifa, a human rights activist and a pioneering journalist from Bahrain. Without further ado, first up, Javier El-Hage.
Thank you, Bobby. For the past couple of years at the Human Rights Foundation, thanks to a generous grant of the John Templeton Foundation, we've been working on a comparative legal research project called Speaking Freely, where we're focused in studying both the origins and the current abuse of so-called official defamation laws and incitement laws around the world. Quick word about the origins of these type of laws. In Roman law, under Emperor Augustus, he passed a law called the Lex Majestatis. So based on this Lex Majestatis, it was a crime called majestas, which translates to treason, or treason law, which involved at the time what we see today as incitement and defamation. Quick jump to the 1600s. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, there was a crime called seditious libel. That was used a lot in the American colonies until the Peter Zenger case changed that, but that also was used in England and led to usually both these crimes in ancient times and in the Renaissance led to the death penalty. Now, about the abuse of this type of laws today, this is a good example. Just a couple of months ago, this Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia was executed on grounds of inciting social strife for criticizing public policy by the Saudi monarchy against the Shia minority in that country. Under the exact same charge, incitement to social strife, the main leader of the opposition in Kazakhstan was sent to jail for 15 years just recently, also a couple of years ago, in that country. The same Leopoldo Lopez, one of the main opposition leaders in Venezuela, just as in Kazakhstan, Vladimir Kozlov, Leopoldo Lopez, in Venezuela, totally different continent, very similar charge, incitement to commit a crime. He's been serving, he's on his second year now, and he's going to have to serve 14 years in prison in that country. Liu Xiaobo, Nobel Peace Prize, he was supposed to get the prize in 2010 in this town, in this city. He wasn't able to do it because he was in jail. The charge, incitement to subvert the powers of the state, a very common charge that they use against political opponents in China. All he did was to write a memorandum called Charter 08 as an academic, calling for democratic reform in China, and similarly bogus sounding charge inciting public opinion in Saudi Arabia to jail this human rights lawyer, who is lawyer for a lot of high-profile political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, like Raif Badawi. His name is Walid Abu Al-Khair. Coming back to Latin America, injurious calumny was the charge that Emilio Palacio faced a few years ago, along with the owners of the journal El Universal, for writing on an op-ed piece that the president was a dictator. So the president sued for $40 million. And he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Eventually they got pardoned, but this is used still in Latin America. You'll see tomorrow, hear a little bit more of El Sexto, Danilo Maldonado, charged with insulting the president in the criminal code of Cuba, Desacato, for painting two little porks with the words Fidel and Raúl, and injury or defamation of the injurious kind, of the insulting kind, what in English they call insult laws, being used in Cuba. Something very common in Latin America. In Thailand, unfortunately, too many cases of lèse majesté laws. This is the case of a historian charged also under insulting the monarchy charges. And just yesterday over dinner, I want to put this up because Rafael Marquez de Moraes from Angola is here with us. He wasn't here last year at the Oslo Freedom Forum. He had to send a video because he was facing trial on defamation charges for a book that was published outside of Angola where he criticized the government of Angola, and he had to face defamation charges because of that. So the abuse of defamation and incitement laws as a trend is very clear. And we kind of knew this at the beginning of this project. Now, we were faced with the dilemma: how do we approach this issue? Do we, in order to advocate for a more protective standard of freedom of speech across the world? And we face the dilemma: should we go to philosophical ideas on the Enlightenment, the French Encyclopedia, to influence civil law tradition countries, or Montesquieu, the same thing, or maybe Areopagitica, more on the common law tradition, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, John Milton's seminal speech. But then we realize, if you look at it more closely, these are not advocates that at the time are advocating against the government for a theory that will protect their rights more. They usually, in order to advocate for free speech, they go and find arguments that are more removed from the present reality, political reality, and these arguments at the time, for someone like John Milton, was ancient Greece. So the title itself of his speech is Areopagitica, borrowing from a Greek poet. Something similar can be said of what Montesquieu did. In fact, he was quoting in his famous work on the separation of powers. What he was doing is he was speaking about the Constitution of England and how that led to more political liberty. So that role that is seen positively, popularly, and that comes from a neutral, independent source is played today to a great extent in most countries around the world by international law. So we see that, for example, this seminal work by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 1994, stating that the Desacato laws in the Americas, which are, again, insult laws in the Latin American tradition, came through the Napoleon codes into Latin America and came all the way from Roman law, that they were incompatible with the Inter-American Commission. That led to the eventual repeal of a lot of these laws in Latin America, especially Argentina being one of the most important cases of this type of repealing. So, and to close this argument on the importance of international law today, you had Patrick Stewart on this a viral video from a couple of weeks ago, basically stating that that it was the European Convention of Human Rights that gave Britain free speech, something that obviously it's subject to contention, but that's how popular international law is in around the world. So we, in our study, are doing something similar, looking at compatibility of the legal regimes in most countries around the world and with the international standard on incitement, the international legal standard on incitement, and the international legal standard on defamation laws, looking at what countries are compliant and what countries are non-compliant. We do this by looking at specific cases. This is a case in Vietnam, a country that is not compliant. Why? Because each of the elements that amount for the international law and incitement, how strict they need to be in order to be compliant with international law, are analyzed there, and that's why Vietnam fails, because in this particular case, as in other cases, it's failed. Another example with Argentina, this is also a seminal case, measured under the same standard. Case in Russia, the same thing. This one is on incitement though. And finally, once you click on that, this is an interactive map that we were able to create thanks to the help of the John Templeton Foundation and the Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. And after that, so you click on read more, it tells you for most countries, some countries, not all in the world, but for example, Latin American countries, European countries, African countries, they have two standards to follow. The universal standard called on by the UN and the regional standards, Inter-American, the African, or the European standards that apply to them as well. We measure each country under both standards in this project that again is starting and it's only on a beta version, but this is what I came here to present to you today. Thank you.
I am delighted to be here. Let me start by adding a footnote that you can make as you will to Javier's wonderful talk. When John Milton wrote the Areopagitica, he was arguing against the power of censorship, arguing against the censor, when after the Glorious Revolution, as it was called, the government changed, Milton became the censor. So you can decide what to make of that example, ironic as it may be. I'm not sure I should be here. This forum, as it is described in all of the materials in the program and so on, is for dissidents, advocates, activists, philanthropists, journalists, artists, entrepreneurs, catalysts, and world leaders. I am none of those. I think of myself as a scholar. I provide information, analysis, occasionally opinions. Some of those may be of some use to the people in the long list that I mentioned a moment ago, but I'm not in the business of short or intermediate term influence, for better or for worse. So, that said, I've been asked to talk a little bit about US free speech law. My role is not, I repeat, not to defend the US approach to the protection of free speech and free press. On most, but not all issues, as is pretty well known, the US is exceptional. That's not necessarily right, but the US is exceptional, more protective than almost anywhere else on most issues, even more than most other open democracies. The reason I say that this is not necessarily a good thing is that this extreme protection of freedom of speech and freedom of the press often comes at the expense of equality, dignity, privacy, and occasionally even truth. When these values conflict with First Amendment protected values of speech and press. For example, on issues of racist speech and hate speech, The U.S., because of its First Amendment doctrine, is non-compliant or has taken an exception in the language of international law, or a reservation in the language of international law, to the requirements in the 1965 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination that signatory nations should have laws prohibiting the incitement to racial hatred. The U.S. is reserved on this because racist speech, hate speech, commercial advertising, the expenditure of vast amounts of money for political candidates, all of that is protected under current American free speech doctrine, not necessarily for the better. Now, that said, there are three areas, especially in light of what this forum and this symposium is about, in which the U.S. Can be somewhat instructive. First of all, defamation. Since 1964, in a case called New York Times versus Sullivan, it is impossible for a public official to bring an action for defamation, whether civil or instituting a criminal action, unless it can be proved that the publisher not only published something false, but knew it was false at the time of publication. And that must be proved by clear and convincing evidence, even in a civil case. The actual practical upshot of this is that for all practical purposes, there are no longer defamation actions brought by public officials in the US. Unlike even some number of otherwise open democracies, defamation lawsuits, defamation actions are not part of political debate. Civil cases, criminal cases have, for all practical purposes, been totally eliminated. Second, incitements, which Javier mentioned, and others will talk about it, based on a 1969 case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, involving, perhaps ironically, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. People can be punished for incitement to unlawful action only if they have used explicit words of incitement, only if they are inciting to immediate or imminent unlawful action, and only if the unlawful action is likely to occur imminently or immediately. What this means, once again, is that for all practical purposes, actions against people for inciting to violence, to crimes, to murder, to revolution, and so on, have been eliminated in the US. I can, in the US, publish an article in a newspaper or stand in the park and make a speech praising the 9/11 bombers and hoping that something like that happens again, and urging people to do it again. That's not my personal preference to do so, but that under current American doctrine is protected, and actions for incitement have by and large been eliminated. Third, also mentioned previously, insult. Under US law, Americans are, and anyone else, are free to insult, ridicule, satirize, mock governments, government officials, and the like, as much as they want. There was a case in a lower court some years ago that had pictures of all of the actual Supreme Court justices, but it only had the justices' heads. Below the justices' heads were the justices' robes, but the justices' robes were open, revealing nothing whatsoever underneath the robes. An action was brought entirely protected. The American, now late American religious leader, Jerry Falwell, brought an action some years ago against Hustler magazine, which had suggested that Falwell's first sexual encounter was with his mother in an outhouse. He sued, he lost. That kind of mocking, insulting, and the like is protected. I will finish then by just noting that this extreme doctrine is not necessarily without costs. It may, and this is a subject of debate, cause good people to stay out of public life, to stay out of government life. It may, and it is a subject of some debate, cause people to respect government less, and that may have an effect on the willingness of people to obey the law, do other civic-minded things, and so on. So without any strong endorsement, but at least in some areas it's instructive, that's the current state of American law, and on these basic issues, Donald Trump's urgings notwithstanding, that is not likely to change in any of our lifetimes. Thank you.
I think I'll do what the professor did and sit down. I think that's the privilege of being a little older than the younger people who will stand. Thank you very much for coming to this, and thank you to Human Rights Foundation for inviting me to this forum. I want to talk a little broader than what's been going on around the context of free speech. My name is Maina Kiai. I am the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Peaceful Assembly. So in the context of broadening it from individuals who are exercising their speech, but people coming together in an assembly and then articulating their speech and their demands through protests, through sit-ins, through occupies, whatever it is we want to call it. And in that context, what we've got, and what I'd like to put down, is you've heard from the sense that's there, you'll hear again from the context of Bahrain and across the world. I think we can say safely that we are in a contestation today between democracies and non-democracies. So it's not about countries anymore, it's about philosophy, it's about ideology. And what you're seeing today is the non-democrats who are across the world, north, south, east, west, are winning the battle. And they're using various tools to keep the democrats aside and push them aside. So you find one of the tools that's used is this free speech limitations, the incitements and other things. But they're also using a new tool, which is now called the closing space for civil society organizations. And they're closing this space because when we come together, all of us as a community, we are much more effective, we're much more louder when you're many than when you're one. So you're finding across the world, civil society is having tremendous trouble being able to articulate itself, being able to push its agenda, and being able to challenge. So you're seeing over and over again, dissent is rising, intolerance is rising. And what you've got to try and do now is find a way for the Democrats to push back and be able to reclaim the space and indeed expand that space as much as we can. So this is not a question about the North or the East or the West or the South. It's across the country. You have rules in Spain, new laws that have been passed in Spain, that if you protest without permission from the authorities, you will be fined up to 300,000 euros at one go. What's the effect of that? It's to silence people. You have rules, you have a policy going on in the UK today, where if you wear a band, like this I'm wearing, a wristband, but it supports PLO, and you happen to be a Muslim, then you are going to be accused of being an extremist and therefore going to be taken through a process of being dealt with. So Islamophobia is rising in that way, and this idea of extremism. You have a new approach in Cambodia, where if you wear black on a Monday, you're seen as a potential protester and you can be arrested at any time. That's your expression. So, and this is going on, so I'm giving you a few examples. And then, of course, as we know, in Uganda and in Nigeria, if you gather around and you have a rainbow flag that you support LGBT rights, you can be arrested, you can be jailed, you can be harassed. This is non-democrats versus democrats. Now, the major way it's going, there are three ways in which this is all going. One is that the first part we're seeing this is the pushback against protesting and people coming out. A lot of that comes from the reaction to the Arab Spring and the fact that for the first time ever, people in Middle East, North Africa rose up against their leadership. It was completely unexpected. If one zone in the world was known to be under tight control, it was the Arab countries. And then they rose up with Tunisia starting off and the rest. And since that time, if you go back again to the color revolutions that happened in the former Soviet Union, then the state starts crumbling. It starts hurting and closing down. Protests are powerful. Protests are useful. And they are legitimate under international law. But what states are doing is that they're beginning to put in restrictions and demanding to turn the right to assembly into a privilege, which is why they say that before you protest, you must have permission. that then means it's no longer a right. It means that the state can determine, if the state can determine whether you exercise your right or not, that becomes then a privilege that the state dispenses with. The second thing that we're seeing a lot in terms of the new trend is the question of terrorism and extremism. There are few reasons and excuses given as much as terrorism and extremism. And we are all afraid of terrorists, for sure. Nobody wants to see them around, and it affects us. And so therefore a very effective tool for the non-democrats to use to try and put us down and try and hold us down. But they're going way too far. And when you have places like, as I said, the UK, where you wear a wristband that says you support PLO, whether you like the Palestinian state, then you're going to be in trouble for what it is. Every single country today, and I think, as you know, in Azerbaijan and other countries, if you stand up against a state, they call you a terrorist. In Ethiopia, if you blog as a Zone 9 blogger and write that we would like to have more space, they call you a terrorist. Across the world, this is going on. It's a new tool. If you're actually working to hold the state accountable in how it is working to deal with terrorism, as the organization Muhuri in Kenya shows, then you'll be labeled a friend of terrorists, simply because you're holding the state accountable. So this whole dilemma around it is about Democrats versus Democrats. The other new trend that's emerging is a world that is moving and opening itself up to business at the expense of everything else. So it's no longer human beings at the front of everything, it is money. Now, none of us is opposed to money as an issue, and that's fine. But when the pursuit of profit defeats and weakens human beings, then we have a problem. And when you find laws in the different parts of the world that say that if you oppose exploitation of natural resources in Guatemala, then you are committing a treasonable offense, which goes against the economic interests of the country, you're in trouble. Canada passed a law last year which says that economic interests were part of national security interests. So if the Canadian government wants to go and frack and wants to go and do tar sands and you oppose it, then you are going to be liable for affecting the national security interests of the Republic of Canada. And it goes on and on and on. So, we did a study over last year looking at the enabling environment that states give to businesses on one side and what states give to civil society on the other. And I can tell you it's night and day. Businesses are all open. Please come and invest. The government of Rwanda says you can register a company in 6 hours online. It's that quick. When you try and register an NGO, it takes you 6 months. And with a lot of checks, they come to your home, they ask who your mother is, who was your father, were they involved in the genocide, were they not? It's a whole host of questions. And I asked the government of Rwanda, why do you do this? What's this? And they say, well, these NGOs, they can be very difficult, we have to make sure they are good. Then I said to them, but you don't think businesses can do the same things as NGOs can? They said, well, that's different, businesses want money. I said, but that's the easiest thing to do. So it's a whole dialectic that's going on in the world where businesses are open, everybody else is not very safe. So I want to leave you with those few words, but also refer you to a report I released with my compatriot, the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, on managing a compilation of best practices on how to manage protests, which will look at different things which the state should do under international law to make sure that protests are facilitated and are helped. So if anything if you leave with anything from this meeting today and from this session today, I would like you to go with the sense that we are in a struggle, and I think it's an urgent struggle. I think it's an important struggle. It's not the Cold War, East versus West. It's not, because it's everywhere in the world, but there is a conflict going on between Democrats and non-Democrats, and we have to be on the side of the Democrats in this area. Thank you very much.
First, I would like to thank everyone for inviting me to Oslo, and I think this is a great opportunity to raise the issue of Bahrain. And at the beginning, I don't know what to say about Bahrain. Too many things happened after 2011. And it's just my colleague from the UN, he just mentioned about the right to assemble. Simply, in my country, If you go and assemble, it's a crime. Talking about restrictions, hatred, inciting, criticizing anything, it is a crime. Journalists could be a terrorist. You could be labeled as a terrorist as well. So it is not really easy to work in an environment that people don't believe really in free speech or in democracy or human rights. And plus, Bahrain is different. And I don't know how many of you knows Bahrain in the region. It's a tiny island in the Gulf. We're totally different with our neighboring countries, especially Saudi Arabia. So we do have things that others don't have, especially when it comes also to women's rights. Talking about the freedom of press in Bahrain, we did have some political reform, which started in 2001. And this kind of, I call it a small political reform. Why? Because it allows us to form political societies. We can't say political parties, so we use the term societies. We had some peaceful gathering and independent newspaper, which was formed by my husband, Al-Wasat, in 2002. It is the only independent newspaper in Bahrain. And the style of this newspaper is totally different from the Gulf region because it's not owned by a government or by merchant families, but in Bahrain the idea was to form all Bahrainis from different backgrounds. And since we're an island, so we're very cosmopolitan and very mixed, we're not really tribal society. Shia and Sunni gathered and formed this newspaper. However, we did have some freedom till 2006. But this did not really continue. Why? In 2011, too many things happened. Many young people, and including me, we thought maybe something will happen and we will have a pluralism in media, free speech, exercise our rights. Everybody wanted to have a civil rights. People went out not to have an Islamic state or to have something. They wanted to have a civil state, a state that respects you and treats you as a human being. But what happened that we witnessed something totally different. We saw restriction increasing continuously until present. Many laws and regulations, the whole region changed. And then every law, every case was labeled against journalists, activists. Simply they managed to silence everybody, and they succeed. They succeed. Bahrain is left out in the Arab world. The whole media is busy about other countries, with all respect to the Syrians, the Yemenis. Even Yemen is left out, so it's more like Syria. Nobody really talks about Bahrain. Therefore, we see bloggers, publishers of tweets, photojournalists, foreign correspondents, local reporters were all subjected to strict regime of procedures, and therefore you don't see too many people coming to Bahrain trying to report. And if you will report, you should have to report the beautiful things. But when it comes about rallies and assemblies and violations, you're not allowed to do this. As a result, they applied a very strict visa regulations. It is not easy to report on these cases. Today, for example, we reported about a Bahraini lawyer, Taimur Karimi, who was by court order asked to leave the country and revoke citizenship. These kind of issues happening in Bahrain, just because you come from a certain background, from a sect, and plus because we have other issues of division in society. Journalists like me faces a lot of challenges. I'm not the only one. Many of my colleagues, they work without their press accreditation. Many, they get attacked in the social media, labeled by names, attacking the family. Simply, journalists in Bahrain, they witness too many things. And nobody really likes to hear the truth. One of the things, the funniest things, I have to share this with the audience, is beginning of this year, with the restrictions now, we are not allowed to post videos on our website in the newspaper or post videos in YouTube. Everybody is giving me this expression, facial expression, yeah. This happening in Bahrain, yeah. And we ask the officials why, and they implemented this restriction in January 2016 up to now. And they set regulations. In Bahrain and in the Gulf region, everything it's about regulations. Regulations in everything, in dress code, in eating, in implementing laws, everything is regulations. And if you do something totally different, then you're either, somebody who is out of tradition, or you are a terrorist or whatever, with these new definitions they are using. What I want to say, it is really hard to work in an environment that they don't, you just mentioned about the conflict between democracy, people who believes in democracy and people who is more into dictatorship. This is in all around the Arab world. I don't want to say this country or that country. What we really need, we need to fix our internal problems. We're sick and tired hearing things which is not true. We need our voice to be out loudly. Al-Wasat, when it was formed for all Bahrainis. We want to see more independent media in Bahrain. A final thing I want to say, since I come from the Gulf region, my colleagues in Kuwait have more freedom to criticize than us. Today morning I heard that the Saudis, they are the more who use YouTube and Twitter. It is not, the fact is they use it not because they feel like they want to use it. It's the fact there is a kind of a social frustration, access to information, and also to raise your voice. But in the same time, many people get arrested, punished, and also we have the issue of impunity. People can attack you easily, threaten you in the social media. So simply, this is what's happening in Bahrain. And I don't know really what will happen more and more. And if you need to ask me any question later, I'm more than happy to answer you.
Well, thank you all for those very illustrative and sort of opening remarks. I want to pick up on something Maina said about the enabling environment that allows for this kind of misuse by people and institutions and authority of existing statutes or proposals for new statutes to go after criticism, to go after opposition. What is it that is common in the enabling environment in Canada and France on the one hand, and Bahrain and Azerbaijan on the other hand? Why is it, in your opinion, that we're seeing an almost universal trend in this direction? What is it that the Canadian government fears that the Azerbaijani or the Bahraini government fears, and why are they all behaving in the same way?
I think that's a very broad question. I hope I can answer it well. So, but I think, Bobby, the first thing, one of the things, at least in parts, every country is specific, okay? But I think in Canada, what was the driving force was this very strong free market fundamentalism, actually, if you wish, that was existing in the Harper government, where the big thing for Harper was get as much money as you can. We have to invest, we have to trade. And actually, if you look at some reports done in that region, the Americas region, Canadian companies have been accused tremendously of violating rights of people in Latin America around mining. As you know, 40% of the world's largest mining companies are registered in the Toronto Stock Exchange. So the Canadians have got a huge thing about mining and extraction of natural resources, and they want to protect that, they want to continue with that. So that's a very significant free market fundamentalism, if you wish. I think other countries, if you look at Spain, the reason why they did their laws in terms of limiting protests was again the lesson that they think that the Greeks taught them. You know, when the rise of the left-wing group that rose, and by being able to mobilize people, so to sustain themselves in power, they think that if they stop people from protesting, then they will stay in power. In other countries, it's issues. Mostly it's about power and maintaining power. How do you keep that going? Azerbaijan, Bahrain. I mean, you can go through so many countries where dictators or people so want to stay in power, and they think they own that if you can't express yourself, whether it is going to be in the media or internet, if you can't express yourself in the streets, media, internet, everywhere else, then you're not opposing them, which is of course a fallacy. And the danger of that, and which I keep trying to tell as many governments as I can, the danger is that if human beings don't have an open place to express their views, the government can never know. First, the government can never know what is going on wrong and how deeply people feel about it. But the second thing is that it then drives people underground. And once you're driven underground, then who knows what's going to happen then? Who knows what reaction is going to happen? And I think that Syria teaches us a lesson that when you stop people from protesting and start killing them, then one way people react is taking up guns themselves and fighting you. So I think we've got a danger in the world where we think that because of economic recession, because of all the problems going on in the world, because of the crisis of governance that exists, and people wanting to stay in power in themselves, then they can do whatever it is. Now, one last thing, because I think it's important. What I found fascinating in the years I've been doing this mandate is that countries are very open to business. So if India is a good example, it's welcoming foreign investment. Please bring your money to India. There's many things to do in India in terms of business. But don't give money to any NGO. If you do that, that's different. So foreigners can put money into businesses, but don't put money into NGOs. Ethiopia is a good example again. Ethiopia foreign direct investment has risen since 2009 by about 2,000%. But don't put any money into human rights NGOs, to the freedom factor. So there's a whole sense, and I think partly is the rise of China, which developed this idea that you could be a unilateral state without any controls, but then business can happen and go on. So there's that Chinese model beginning to take part, to spread in many parts of Asia. Vietnam is a good example. Cambodia is now trying it. Ethiopia is trying it. Rwanda is trying it. So quite a few countries are trying this monolithic political approach, but probably an open market system for business.
Fred, would you like to take that question as well?
Well, just a couple of little things. One, it may be a mistake to compress too many different countries and too many regimes into one. The notion that we should not think that Canada or the US on these issues are the same as Azerbaijan. There are occasional troubling things in my own country. There are occasional troubling things in Canada. But by and large, these remain places where seditious libel, treason by words, and so on is by and large permitted. The other thing I would mention, we've been talking here about government. One of the lessons of perhaps the greatest work on free speech ever written, Chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, spends a great deal of time talking about social intolerance as well as government restriction. That in many different dimensions, one of the things that's worth worrying about is what are the kinds of things that in terms of non-governmental environments, social environments, gossip networks, and everything else just cannot be said. One final little word in answer to your question. One of the interesting things that's happened in the US over the last 10 years is that the political valence of freedom of speech has by and large flipped. Back when most of the free speech litigants were civil rights protesters or communists or socialists or anti-Vietnam War protesters, free speech was by and large an argument of the political left. In the last 10 years, as issues of the feminist take on pornography, commercial advertising, campaign speech, and the like have come to the forefront. Most of, at least in the courts and also outside of it, a great deal of free speech advocacy now comes from the political right. You can decide what that means, but there's been a dramatic change in the valence, in the US at least, of free speech argumentation.
Reem, you lived through the Arab Spring and the impact it had on Bahrain. At first, those of us outside the Arab world look at it as a hopeful expression of what sort of free speech can do, and how digital channels, social media, were allowing free speech to circumvent government restrictions. But governments around the world, and especially in the Arab world, have become much better at controlling or monitoring, policing free speech on those same social networks. And they are now themselves using those social networks to target people such as yourselves. Can you talk a little bit about how, you mentioned it in your opening remarks about being labeled on social media. How does the state of Bahrain go after its critics on social media?
I mean, they monitor everything. It is, for example, you're not allowed to report or criticize the war in Yemen. If somebody criticized that as a tweet, easily could be taken to court, and then they file a case against you.
And the charge is?
It depends. I mean, there is one case I remember was like somebody who's a political figure, an activist, was sentenced to 5 years. There is a beginning of this year about what happened in Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia, about the Shia cleric. Somebody also tweeted, and also I think he's a doctor, and he was also taken to 1 year or 6 months, if I remember that exactly. So basically, it is not really easy to tweet freely when it comes to this is something really I need to highlight, is not necessarily politically, but also when it comes to sect or to religion. These are also red lines and maybe irritates the audience. And plus, if they don't like someone, if it's a human rights defender or a journalist, and I have to say, I like to be an independent journalist, but in a situation how we live in our region, we are labeled like human rights defenders because we see things. But it is very hard if you compare the thing to the standard in the West. Coming back to your question, yes, they label the people who they don't like. Like, for example, I know a couple of journalists, including my husband. Every day they just write names and they just circle your face and pictures. And if you want to go and file a case that somebody is threatening you, then forget it. And this is another topic about impunity in Bahrain. It could be different issue in other parts of the world, but in our region, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, these cases are too similar. I believe also in Saudi Arabia. But since I'm from Bahrain, so I'll talk just and focus on Bahrain. But generally, all these restrictions now implemented in all the Arab Gulf states, and it's very hard to stop these restrictions because governments now, they don't like to see somebody saying something different from them.
Javier, in the course of your research, are you noticing patterns in the misuse of social media to try and silence opposition, to try and frighten and intimidate voices like Reem's and to silence?
Yeah, definitely. In countries that have access to the internet, because we have to still consider that the most closed society in the world, like North Korea, there's absolutely no access to the internet. In Cuba, there's very little access to the internet, which is very convenient for the government. The government has no rush in opening up the interest. In fact, there's an interesting video by Juan Triana Cordoví, one of the main economists of the dictatorship, professor at the University of Havana, where he tries to make the argument in front of the political police, saying why they should open up the internet for purposes of improvement in education and in being open to the world. But he says, and the issue of what's going to come with a free internet, meaning free speech, meaning more scrutiny of the government, that issue, he says, is, I leave it to you. This is a speech that he's giving to the political police, and that is on YouTube actually right now. So there are countries like that that actively avoid. The ones that somehow the internet escaped their ability to control them, and one of them, a good recent example, would be Nigeria. They're passing laws in Nigeria. There is a bill that is being currently discussed in the Senate called it's being dubbed the social media bill. It criminalizes any spreading of false information about the government in social media. It specifically says WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. It specifically says, it talks about those apps, banning them, again, any sort of criticism of the government in social media. So I think broadly, as Maina was saying, if you consider, you will see the pattern that democracies, countries that respect the opposition, that don't mind alternating in power, that allow for the opposition to assemble, that allow for big media to exist and criticize the government, in those countries where they repress freedom of speech, and they do repress some sort of social media. There are cases in the United States of people that on Twitter called on killing the president that were investigated by the FBI. Obviously, it's not the same as a case in Bahrain where he would be immediately arrested, probably taken to and actually charged and convicted of terrorism. But there is some sort of restriction. However, this restriction tends to be proportional to the fault in democracies, and what you see is that when you go to democracy through a competitive authoritarian regime, which doesn't get to the point of being a full-fledged dictatorship, but it's already pretty authoritarian, you see that the penalties, the charges are less proportional to the fault. And finally, in dictatorships, and it goes in dictatorships, go from the ones that have more linkage to the West, as Harvard Professor Steve Levitsky calls it, that has more connections to the West. These dictatorships, like Cuba itself, they will imprison El Sexto for 10 months, but they won't anymore convict him for painting a couple of porks for 25 years, as they did just 15 years ago with the 13 years ago with the Black Spring prisoners, with the father of Rosa Maria Payá, etc. So the countries that have more linkage with the West, even if they're dictatorships, they're still going to be more lenient than others like Saudi Arabia, for example, where they, as I was saying, just execute. So this is a pattern. Democracies, competitive authoritarian and fully authoritarian regimes will tend to treat similar offenses differently in terms of the harshness of how they.
I'm going to open up the floor to some questions from the audience, and when you please do identify yourself, and please ask questions specific and state who on the panel you'd like to address your question. If you'd like everybody to take a bite at it, then say so. You had your hands up right here first.
Thank you. You made me to. My name is Jessica Kill. I'm original from Congo Democratic, but I'm Norwegian because I live here. The first thing I want to say, what is the woman's place in media? Because if you see your panel, there's only one lady from
Bahrain.
Where is a place for women to defend us? Because I feel like everything is too masculine in the world now. You decide what we do, what we say, what we write. I understand there are many trouble in the world now. We have this doctor, Sonia Mukwege, who speak about Congolese women who've been raped. I just came from Congo, where we have jail. The youngest kid in jail, the youngest person in jail there is like 5 months because she been born there. But I live in Norway. I love my country, my little country. I've been here for 25 years. 4 years ago, we just got the first African president, and we were out celebrating African women get a right to talk about the violence and everything. From the party to my place, I was beaten just in front of this place because I was black. And when she speak about independent voice in a society, myself, I work, I'm a French speaker, you excuse my English. I write in a newspaper called Aftenposten, which is like I write about debate about how to give a woman place to speak. But you say something, my brother, about anti-democrat and no-democrat. We try to talk. We try to explain what is going on. Everybody knows that Norway is a free country to be. It's not only about America and other places. How do you guys think you can help a woman who wants to speak about her right? Like have my place to sit there and talk like everybody. When you've been beaten because you're a woman and you are black. They are hiding people who doesn't want a woman to speak. What do you do about that? Because she said something about being an independent writer. And when things happen, you ask the police, what can they do for you? They say, we are sorry, we could not be everywhere. So what you guys think about it? How are we gonna get more ladies to speak in this world? Because it's too much violence against us. We want to speak it, we want to have a place.
Really, you want to address that?
Yeah. Trust me, it's not really easy to work in a society. I mean, we don't have this, as I mentioned, Bahrain is not like Saudi. The women issue is totally different there. But the challenges we face, that if you, for example, being in this place, talking to the audience, it could be a crime. Then the officials could file a case against me saying that I promote something nasty about Bahrain. But it is not about, when I criticize, it's not about criticizing the things that it could upset the government. It is to achieve goals as a part of a democratic process. I'm not going to compare my society to the society here, but at least to achieve the goals that implement a human dignity and pride. Why the Arab Spring happened in the Arab world? It happened because everybody wanted to feel that they have a dignity and pride. You don't see this exist. Civil rights doesn't exist in the Arab world. It's not there. So when you want to raise the issue of women's rights, it is also hard. In my country, we were trying to raise issues related to some UN agreement, convention, something like related, and then they were like, there was a debate in the parliament. This kind of thing, you wouldn't see about women discrimination and blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't see this kind of debate, for example, in Saudi Arabia. But you will see this kind of debate in Bahrain, in Kuwait. Why? Because still the society a little bit lively. And in Bahrain, we do have establishment for a civil society, despite we had a severe crackdown against the civil society. The press is struggling. The political societies or the political party also what they call it between brackets opposition, they're not there. So the women's role in the society also can't be really shown clearly because of all these troubles. But in the same time, you see some of these women activists and women writers trying to take an advantage of the things that are happening right now to raise issues about Sharia court, for example, about custody, divorce. And since we are a society, we have too many sects, and also we have division, unfortunately. So people could raise some issues, and I think it's another challenge for a woman. And being independent, yeah, I mean, it's a big thing, not just in Bahrain, in the Arab world, because you need to be either with the official side or with the other side. You can't be in between, and we try to be in between to improve things without having these regulation and restrictions that it doesn't really progress anything. For example, when I mentioned about the YouTube.
Mustafa, could you go next?
Well, thanks for the fascinating panel. A question to Dr. Schauer, if I say it right. You explained that in the US, like, public officials cannot blame people for defamation, being defamed, or they're not protected by law about that, and that's a great idea, I think. What about individuals? Like, what is the limit for individuals to be defamed by the media or on social media, and when it becomes criminal? If you can give a few examples of that.
Okay, in American doctrine, there is a distinction between so-called public figures, which includes public figures who are involved in policy debates, but also includes public figures who are famous even though they're not involved in policy debates, footballers and movie stars and so on. Public figures are treated like government officials. They can only win a libel action if they can prove intentional falsity by clear and convincing evidence. For purely private individuals, they only have to prove negligence. That's an easier standard, but by and large, even when individuals sue under the existing standards, they tend to lose. So the big distinction in the doctrine is between the public, which includes not only government officials, but large number of other public people in general, and private individuals. The private individuals have an easier time of it, but still pretty hard.
So, lady back there.
Thank you. It's fascinating because in Turkey, where I'm coming from, it's the other way around. Public officials are protected more because they're greater people than us mortals, especially the biggest public official is incredibly protected.
Yes, I should mention, in light of that, or as a footnote to what I was saying earlier, Mr. Bowerman clearly can say what he wants to say about the president in the US, even if he can't say it in Germany.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm a student. And I wanted to ask this to Reem. It seems very clear that there are two ways that people are being silenced or free speech is being limited. One by the government, but also by the irresponsibility of people who just speak without knowing the facts or seek to spread disinformation or racist or discriminatory speech that is very, very harmful, right? I was wondering, does your identity have an effect on that? And namely, I'm talking about being a woman and being a journalist because it seems, do you ever get discredited or not listened to or taken seriously because of your gender as a female journalist, and how do you counter that?
Well, in Bahrain, as I mentioned, we don't have the state gender issue. I mean, yeah, a female journalist will struggle because journalism is a hard job. So not really too many women will go for this kind of job in my country or in the region. Some they favor just to write short articles or op-ed inside office rather than reporting and going out and trying to chase this official or do this story or put themselves in trouble. But I have to say, with the social change, with the things that happened, you see more women voice, whether they are journalists or activists or even in an official position in Bahrain. So the voice of women is heard in Bahrain. but you need to be careful what issue you need to raise. I mean, some of them, they will just defend the restrictions that I just mentioned, and some no, they will go beyond to rebel against these restrictions. So yes, I think it's really hard if we say it's a gender. So we don't have this gender issue, but we do have other issues also when it comes to some of the regulations implemented against women in Bahrain, and that's what we are raising it now in the press and in the parliament, even if it's our parliament is cosmetic.
There's a lady here with the question. If you can show your hands now, if you want to ask the next question, then we'll make it easier for the...
This question is from Maina. Right, way to say it. I'm so interested in this concept of closing space, and it makes me think a lot about the idea of a third place.
Yourself.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Amy Benziger. I'm one of the producers on the film Checkmate. So I'm really interested in this idea of a space and space being held, and this idea of potentially the internet and the web being kind of a third place, right, where people can come and have creative dialogue. So I'm wondering, it's so incredible to hear of all the different ways that you're seeing the linkages in between these different countries, but most of the time these stories are reported on a country by country basis, and people aren't seeing these patterns and aren't seeing the bigger picture. So I'm wondering, in your mind, what's the solution, or what's a creative way in which the web does serve as a third space, but is able to tell that bigger picture? Is that independent websites for all of these different people, when that gets scattered and lost, how do you see the future of that story being told?
That's a tough question about what people should be doing. I think just look at it. I think there's a lot of efforts that are going on trying to bring the information together. Quite a few organizations are trying to bring it together and trying to show the linkages and what's happening from country to country, region to region. I think some have got nice maps, and the ICNL, International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, based in Washington, has a pretty good analysis that they're doing on that. And the other one is Civicus, that does quite good work around looking at the different forms of work. But I think one of the things I'll be doing next year, and I want to do my report for June next year to the Human Rights Council, looking at civil society, just analyzing what is civil society, what good has it done, and where the challenges we go on. It's going to be my last report to the UN's Human Rights Council. There's a way to tie all these things together as much as I can. I think but I think the question we keep asking ourselves is the why, and we can speculate a lot about why is this happening. And so I have a report coming out in June looking at fundamentalism and looking at fundamentalism as one of the underlying features that's leading governments and others to start closing the space. So this whole intolerance thing, if you wish, and it's religious, it's economic in terms of free market, it's nationalistic, where the Chinese, for example, don't want Tibet to exist in any form of way. So there's a lot of different examples you can lead to, but often we talk about fundamentalism, we think about religious fundamentalism, and it's one of the issues, I think, where you see, and that's more interesting because we're looking at about almost every major religion has some intolerance built into it, whether it's the Christians who are pushing anti-gay laws across the world, the Christian fundamentalism, or it's the Buddhists in Burma who are pushing the Rohingya Muslims out and saying they're not Islamic, or Islamic fundamentalism in Saudi Arabia that's basically saying no, you can only have one religion in Saudi Arabia and other places, or Hindus in India, which is being pushed by the Prime Minister about this Hindu fundamentalism against Islam and other religions. So it's almost everywhere. There's Jewish fundamentalism, if you wish, that's going on against everybody else. So there's a real sense, and I'm not, it's trying to pinpoint why it's happening is not clear, but I think we are at a stage in our lives where we become much more intolerant of others and of the rest. And somewhere, some point we lost to the level of tolerance. And it's interesting, as Professor says, that a lot of the cases now being pushed in the QS cases are from the right. And that's an interesting fact in and of itself, that the right is the one that's leading the charge to expand space, that's using it. And I think sometimes it's the success of the tolerant move, the people who are tolerant and open, the open societies became too successful, and I think they're hurting now because they've lost the tools. So it's a lot of things we can do. I think partly is learn from the past, learn from how the world has dealt with other schisms that exist whether it's a Cold War, others that existed. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Amin from Azerbaijan, and explaining that in the Cold War, for example, the West would take money to Solidarity in Poland in suitcases. Norwegians and Swedes would take money in suitcases to the African National Congress in South Africa because they wanted to move it. Now, if you try and take money in a suitcase to an NGO in India, there's all these protocols with Zan and.
Yeah, but now you have Bitcoin. Now you have Bitcoin,
yes.
and I don't mean to be facetious, but if I can just follow up on that question, can the web be an alternate space? If governments are trying to close physical space, do you see the web providing an outlet for that need to gather?
It does help, but up to a point, because you cannot do a revolution on the internet. You can bring people together, but you need bodies on the street. So it is a useful space, there's no doubt about that. But again, governments are also becoming clever, so they're beginning to control that. And the amount of surveillance, as we see in the US with the NSA, across the world, everywhere, the surveillance is massive right now. In Uganda recently, they had an election, and what the president did, they did this close down the entire internet so that information couldn't be passed. So there was no WhatsApp, there was nothing you could do because the internet is closed down. So they're getting, if not smarter, much more much more brutal. So just close down the internet. I can't control what's going on in there, so I close it down. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of that as we go.
Fred, you have a thought?
Just, let's not glorify space too much. Space is just a place to replicate social life in general. And this may go back to the first question there. About 40 years ago, somebody was making a reasonably standard anti-governmental free speech lecture saying, government shouldn't decide who gets to say what. Herbert Marcuse was in the audience and blurted out perceptively, who decides now? When government is out of the picture, all of the dynamics, all of the hierarchies and everything else that exists in social life are still there. So we should be careful of assuming that governmentally free space is some sort of utopia in which every voice is socially and politically equal.
Or responsible. There was a question from the lady there with the show. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Justine Hardy, former speaker here on the impacts of violence on mental health. It's a question for Maina, but for all of you really. Talking about this idea of the Chinese model being used, whether it's in India or China or elsewhere. So everything is open to money, whether it's INGOs or NGOs finding it very hard to operate at all. Any suggestions, ideas of what can be done because business is open as usual, but everything else is shut?
Any chance businesses can be persuaded to make the argument that it's not enough just to open your markets, you have to open your minds?
Well, I think a lot of the business, it's a process that has to start at some point where there has to be a reach out to the businesses that are in these countries. There's got to be that alliance built and beginning of those alliances to be built. I think that if you look at, one of the interesting things we found out was that where space exists for civil society, it inevitably exists for businesses, but not vice versa. And I think what we also found is only one country in the world that is hostile to business and hostile to civil society, and that is Venezuela. Everybody else is welcoming to business. So yes, there's a case to be made about talking to businesses and asking them to join in this and try and add their voice to it. I think the other part of it is being creative in terms of how we can, I don't think in any society space is given by a government. You have to start fighting for it, which is why freedom of assembly is so crucial, because people have to get out and start demanding. And I think that's how you get the space. So in a sense, it's to activate and facilitate the people to come out as much as they can. And yes, he's right. And I think there are going to be other contradictions and other issues in society, even if there's space. But at least we won't have that market space that's equal for all of us to compete in that form. So I think government space, the space that is national space where governments are restricting us, is crucial because it stops us from having the space to be able to compete with ideas, and that's what we want to do in every space. So I think the space context is very, very important, and I think it's crucial because you can't get good ideas if there's repression of that space. So I think that the discussion is still ongoing about what can be done, and I think people are figuring out whether to use a Cold War methodology from the Cold War, other ways in which we can go. The internet is vital, social media is vital. How do we keep that expanding rather than constricting?
Javier, you have a thought?
Yes, I think we have to use, there's this great book called Previous Post on how human beings, evolutionary biology is a big thing right now in general in the sciences, and this is how we're predisposed to be either left-wing or right-wing. Therefore, there's no, a lot of the people that are the best defenders of the ideas of the right, at some point for left-wing, therefore they study political science or philosophy or economics even, whereas if you're more like conservative from the beginning, you don't waste your time doing all those social sciences and you prefer to go to finance directly, you never get involved in this. So there are these drivers of human behavior or left-wing and right-wing. Now therefore we need to, I believe, advocate for whether you're left-wing or right-wing, understand the virtues of freedom of goods and services, the marketplace, if you will, for goods and services to be available in greater quantities, that they are usually in places where the market or the exchanges between individuals are not allowed to operate in a fairly free way, and freedom, of course, on the political market, which is, for example, what at the Human Rights Foundation and in most civil rights NGOs around the world focus on. It's political rights, freedom of the press, freedom of the opposition to associate. If we can convince people if we can convince people that those are the virtues and that therefore your political, you shouldn't create political alliances with such regimes like the Cuban regime, for example. What Maina just mentioned, that only Venezuela is, or clearly is, one regime that is an enemy of free markets or of business, if you will, and at the same time an enemy of political freedom. In fact, Cuba is much more close today still than Venezuela, yet it gets a free pass because it's kind of a special circumstance. In Cuba, there is no, one of the main problems right now in Venezuela is the lack of, the price controls all across the economy. That's what leads to shortages in most supermarkets there. In Cuba, there are no supermarkets. There is no pharmacy, no such thing as a pharmacy where you go and buy an aspirin. You have to make a line for 3 hours to get maybe some sort of aspirin they take from. So the market still not, it's definitely not working yet because of these political perceptions. For example, a left-wing government in the U.S. was the one making the deal with a dictatorship under no condition of opening up the political freedom aspect of it and supporting business. So what we do we at the Human Rights Foundation, for example, that are faced with this dilemma, try to point to this to these issues of inconsistency. And for example, we call openly, we say that the Cuba that Raúl Castro is proposing, which is a Cuba that is going the China way, the Cuba that Raúl Castro is proposing is much closer to Pinochet's Chile than it was to the revolutionary Cuba, socialist Cuba of the 60s. Clearly, they're calling for free for businesses. Indeed, Obama met with all the businessmen, the small businesses in Cuba, and with much less protocol, with much less media. Although it was important, he met also with the dissidents. But so the drive is for business at the cost or in disregard of political freedom, which is what China brought. We can't deny the fact that China, the greatly forward China, post-Mao China, the Deng Xiaoping China that lifted 400 million people out of poverty in 25 years through a changing policy from communism to capitalism. We can't deny that that's positive for society overall. However, if you're a dissident, if you disagree with the government, even in the economic policy, you can be at the Nobel Peace Prize writing your little memo at your university. You'll get incitement to social strife and not be able to come to Norway to get your prize. So China is Pinochet Chile. Yes, yet somehow both the left and the right give it a pass. And Cuba, which is Pinochet Chile, happened in 2016. The left is definitely giving it a pass. The right, they we're not giving them a pass anyway before. But so if we can make the left-wing people that are Democrats to lose their alliances with autocrats, regardless of their view on the economy, and do the same on the right. Same happened with I've been to many conferences of free markets and the importance of free markets, where they look at China as a relatively positive example. So if we can get that bias on free marketeers, that China is all positive because of the poverty issue and how the market has worked for good in many aspects of society, to start looking at all of the negative consequences that come from China being a closed society in terms of political liberty, that would be a great advancement that we can make it.
Reem, you had a thought.
Yeah, I just want to say political freedom. I mean, in the region I come from, the Arab Gulf states, we see they have a free market and they do a lot of funding for too many projects around the world. But once they raise the issue, and I'm sure you're aware about issues related to human rights and others, I mean, nobody really raises these issues when it comes with business interests. So, I mean, these countries still they don't have the political freedom, and that's why also young people, they see the platform for the social media a way to express themselves. If we did have a pluralism in media and we allow to form trade unions and opposition and allow people express themselves, we wouldn't have the problem, not just in Bahrain but in the Gulf region. But I don't consider issues related, a driving car is a major issue in my region, while if civil rights is an important issue for me, a social change with political change is a more essential for me. And these countries in the region, if they would take China as an example for, I mean, they could just go ahead with but they want to go ahead with it without this political freedom, and that's why we started to have too many issues, including human rights violation, the issue of freedom of press, etc. Just I wanted to clarify this when it comes to the Gulf region.
Okay, so as I said, all of you will have plenty of opportunity to buttonhole any of the panelists over the next 3 days and sort of dive deeper into their minds on the subject and anything else. Thank you very much for coming, and if I can ask you for one last round of applause for your panel.